Then and we're on. Feels pretty good too. Ooh. Decent little 1.5 pounder maybe. It's just backlash my reel. I got you, man, I got you. Alright, so you're the first one of the day, man. And I just rehooked you. There we go. Thanks, man. Thank you. You definitely smell like a fishy fish. Yeah, we are recording. Good. Oh, you got some sharp teethies on you, man. So here we are. We've been on the water for a while and we just picked up this 1 pound, 1 ounce bass. This is our second bite of the day. I had one on my whopper plopper and tried to turn on the video and lost him doing that. Anyway, we got one. I was thinking about calling it quits, but maybe. Thanks, buddy. Have a good one. Maybe we'll stay for a little bit longer. Thanks for watching. So I recorded the other day. We ended up having a pretty good day that day. 6 bass and a pickerel. And I even recorded a quick highlight of General Greene's life from birth to death. A little bit beyond. Then I went home to compile and edit videos and somehow deleted all of them. I moved them over to my hard drive. I even saw that they had made it onto the hard drive, and then I deleted them off of the GoPro memory card, and that was the extent of it. And for some stupid reason, I thought it would be a good idea before to get rid of the recycling box that I've actually never really used other than to empty it here and there. So they're gone. I don't have any. Well, I do have a recycling box now. Change that up a little bit. So anyway, I figured why not do it again. We've been out here for a while, and we've gotten 2 bites. One off the whopper plopper. I think that was more of a reaction strike. That I lost because for some reason I couldn't get the GoPro to record. The third time that I pressed it, the time that it was successful, I happened to look up to see him jump out and actually spit it out right in front of me, maybe 10 feet from me. So, I mean, I would have much preferred to caught him. But it was pretty neat to see that. It was a pretty big fish, too. I'd say easily 2 pounds. But then we caught another one not long after that on the crankbait, the lipless crankbait. He was 1 pound, 1 ounce. And yeah, here we go. So Nathanael Greene was born to Nathanael Greene and Mary Mott. So Nathanael Greene Sr. was a Quaker minister who was an iron master, and they had a family forge on what was called Forge Farm in Potawatomi. It's actually in Warwick, but it's like right at the East Greenwich line in Rhode Island. And he was born on July 27th, 1742. That is subject to change now, however, when King George II, not the one we fought the war against, that's King George III, but his father, King George II, had adopted the Gregorian calendar, which is the new style, making the old style, which is the Julian calendar, obsolete. So now, officially, his birthday is on August 7th. And today is August 8th. We missed it by a day. Whoops. I seem to have all my days missed by one. So at the homestead, we actually celebrate the 27th as his birthday. And whatever Saturday falls on the closest to his birthday, we do a big celebration in an open house then. So it's always a lot of fun. Well worth checking out. Might even learn something. May even watch a couple cannon get fired. Anyway, moving on. So that's in Potawatomi. And the same year that Nathanael was born, his father purchased property in Coventry, Rhode Island, which is just incorporated the year before. And he purchased over 400 acres on the Patuxent River. So that property had actually sat dormant for 20 years, because in 1762 he decided to open up the second iron forge, and he placed Nathanael Jr. and his brother Jacob as ironmasters there. So Potawatomi to the property in Coventry is about 14 miles. So I mean, 14 miles is not really something I want to drive personally to go to work every day, one way. And that's driving. Nathanael and his brother actually rode their horses 14 miles, worked all day, and then rode back. For 8 years they did that. Really, really long days. And keep in mind, we're talking about an iron forge. And an iron forge is not easy work by any means at all. It's hot, it's uncomfortable, and you are busting your bottom constantly. So, after 8 years of doing that, the year is now 1770, Nathanael gathers his brothers, there's 7 in total, to build himself a home there. And that's the home that we have, Spell Hall. So Nathanael, being a Quaker, was really only supposed to learn the Bible. That was the only bit of diction that you were supposed to know. It was a little different in Nathanael's case because of the family business. So his father let him learn bookkeeping to keep up with the logistical side of managing the iron forge. So Nathanael Greene, General Greene, longed for a formal education. There we go, that's the word. And never received one. So what he did was he opened up his home, Spell Hall, that's the reason it's called Spell Hall, to the children of his forge workers. He had about 150 forge workers in total. So what he invited the kids to come in and take lessons and actually receive a formal education. So Spell Hall is Coventry's first school. It's pretty cool, huh? So we're going to jump forward a little bit more. Now we're going to 1774 at this point. This is when Nathanael Greene decides to marry, with her permission of course, Catherine Littlefield, Catherine with a C, or as most people call her, Katie, but General Greene called her Kitty with a K. So they got married in 1774, and the honeymoon was pretty short-lived, as tensions between the crown and the colonists were really starting to escalate, and clearly starting to get out of control. Nathanael Greene got together with James Barnum, also of East Greenwich, and formed the militia unit called the Kentish Guards. Your Kentish Guards were not your typical militia unit, especially considering that they are a New England militia unit, which tends to have made a different style name for itself than the rest of the militia units throughout the colonies. And this isn't really a good thing. More ragtag, misfits, drunks, far from learning how to be a soldier and preparing themselves for what's going to come, which everybody did know was coming. However, your Kentish guards, let me turn myself a bit here, were not like your typical militia units. They were actually more like your British regulars. They were sharp, they were professional, well dressed, conducted themselves, like gentlemen. And so militia units vote their own officers. Whoever becomes officer of a militia unit, or basically commander of it, reaches the rank of colonel. And when it came time to vote, it came down to two separate names. You had Private Greene and Private Varnum. So naturally, they would choose Varnum to be the officer, right? Does that make sense? It shouldn't make sense. Well, not to you, at least, not yet. Let me tell you about it. So if you ask me how or why, I can't tell you. I can give you speculation. However, we know that Nathanael Greene had a bad knee and walked with a limp. When you have a militia unit that's very sharp and very professional, and you have one member of that unit limping, standing out for the wrong reasons, you're definitely not thinking of this person of being commander of it. So Varnum is now Colonel Varnum. Just an FYI, Colonel Varnum does join the Continental Army at one point in time, and does reach the rank of general as well. Very worthy. He's a great general. So the rest of the militia unit decided, well, not decided, they were hazing Greene because of his limp. So much so that Greene went to Varnum and offered his resignation. And I'm a little bit confused by this, but it is a true story. Varnum denied, would not actually accept his resignation. If you were in the Continental Army, this is something that could easily stand true and happen. But militia units, you're free to come and go as you please. There is no, hey, will you accept my resignation? There's a, here is my resignation, goodbye. But that's not what happened. Anyway, moving on. Easy to get in rabbit holes here. So just a few months later, the Rhode Island General Assembly formed what was called the Rhode Island Army of Observation. Now, this was to be Rhode Island's contribution to the Continental Army. And most colonies were calling their armies of observation. They were to observe the British, not to go to war, or so it says. So when it came time to choose a commander of the Rhode Island Army of Observation, we'll just call it something different for short from this point forward, they chose Private Greene. Now, there's a lot of speculation on this or that, on how exactly he was the one that actually received the promotion. But regardless of this or that, I promise you it did not go into vain. So now Private Greene is Brigadier General Greene, which is 1 star. And his first orders are to march to Cambridge and meet up with General Washington. We're still so early on that the beginnings of the Continental Army are actually still happening right here and now. So Greene arrives, and he arrives roughly about 2 weeks after the Battle of Bunker Hill. And Washington arrives after Greene roughly another 2 weeks later. So Greene sets up camp, as all other armies that have arrived already have done. And Washington arrives with obviously a lot on his plate, a lot of things he needs to figure out. This whole army thing right now is new to everybody, including him. But even with everything that he has to do, the very first thing that he's interested in is checking out his new army. He goes and he surveys the army, which for the most part, just like Rhode Island, it's basically mashups of different militia units forming separate regiments for each colony, soon to be state. And Washington does not like what he sees, to say the least. There's a very famous quote that actually comes from this. It gets pushed onto something separate, but this is actually where it comes from. And what it is, are these the men to which I'm to defend America with? He was saying that because he was scared. Reality was starting to hit. Things were different here, though. When Greene and Washington met, and Washington got to Greene's camp, he was completely impressed with what he saw. Greene had put in place everything that was going on in the Kentish Guards and put it to the Rhode Island Army of Observation. There we go. Had to do it. It was almost immediate. Within 2 days, Greene was one of the 4 original members on the War Council, and remained so until late 1778. In Washington and Greene, we're here. If you're watching the camera, there you go. We're like that. They were tight. A family. Washington considered all of his officers family, but your senior officers you were at Washington's table. You're always welcome. And Greene immediately met up with that. Washington wrote to Congress about General Greene, and now General Greene is no longer Brigadier General of the Rhode Island Army of Observation. He is now Brigadier General in the Continental Army, with the same regiments under his command. He has a battlefield command here. So Boston ends up becoming a siege, a very long siege, roughly about a year, just roughly, we'll say roughly there. Enough time for Washington to send Henry Knox to Fort Ticonderoga, which was captured by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold in 1775, early on 75, and get all the artillery there. And Knox does this, and out of all the artillery that he went and got from there, they had only lost 1 cannon in Lake George. So Ticonderoga is basically at the tip of Lake Champlain, close to Lake George. And he does this in the winter time. And he actually has to wait a few times to wait for the both rivers and ground to freeze over to be able to get all these artillery pieces across. But he manages to do so. And in the spring, the early spring, March, to be in fact, he arrives with the cannon and everything. So immediately, Washington puts him and everybody else to work to fortify Dorchester Heights, and it's got to be done overnight, and it is. So General Howe, who is the commander-in-chief on the British side, woke up to cannons being fired on him from way up top of Dorchester Heights, and realized he was in a perilous position, and it didn't take him long to realize that he needed to leave Boston. The siege was now over. About that morning when he woke up, and this is just a paraphrase, but he says, "By God, Washington made his men do more in 1 night than I can make my men do in 3 months." That was almost dead on, by the way. But that's a very strong statement. Now keep in mind, General Howe is new here. When it came to the Battle of Bunker Hill, and beforehand it was actually General Gage. But the king thought him to be weak against the colonists. Gage had a soft spot for the colonists. He fought again with most of them in the French and Indian War, including Washington and Gates and several others. Got some grass, yay. Nope, just didn't. All right, doesn't make any sense. So the British leave, and Washington leaves his army with Greene, and Greene's with Washington. He's always at his side. Remember this. The British leave, and Washington's army stays put for a while because they're not sure what the next step is going to be. They know it was good, but they know it's going to be bad. So it turns out that the British went to Halifax, basically waiting for replenishments, resupplies, more troops to come in. And when those come in, they all converge in New York Harbor at the same time. When I say they all, it was described as, it looks as all of London is afloat. Over 30,000 troops were about to land on Long Island. Washington's there, Greene's there. Greene sets a pitched battle for, Brooklyn Heights. He has the Rhode Island 1st and 2nd and the Maryland 1st and 2nd right there. I always like to mention those two names in particular because those 4 regiments will always be in history as very gallant fighters. And they should be more well known for what they have done. So the British get into Long Island, they land, and they're landing about 19,000 of their troops right now, and they found a spot that was open and left by Washington and the army called Jamaica Pass, and they obviously exploited it, and they marched all the way to the coast at Brooklyn. Brooklyn Heights was a battle that we definitely lost. It was kind of the last straw for Long Island. And Greene actually, although planned the battle, set up the battle, he did not attend the battle. Greene was actually always a sickly boy with breathing problems and asthma and such like that. It would always haunt him for the rest of his life too. So he did not attend the battle. The battle was lost, and Howe actually had his chance right then and there to put the final blow on the army. But he figured that his men had enough today, because they had marched along all of Long Island, battling the whole time. Ooh, we just got hit. Battling the whole time, and they needed a rest. They were much well deserved of a rest. So he gave his men the rest. Now, it's always being called an act of providence on how Washington and his army were able to escape Long Island into Manhattan, with the fog that was dampening all the sound and the view as well. So Washington had actually set up a regiment to make noise and tend fires all around while all the troops were escaping across the East River into Manhattan. All men get across, and Washington is on the last boat. Not uncommon for him to put himself in harm's way, whether it was a revolution or even the French and Indian War, just so you know. So they get to Manhattan, and the next morning Hal wakes up and realizes he had lost his one huge shot. So he starts sending all his men into Manhattan, and he already has men on the East River as it was that were attacking Brooklyn Heights from behind. So they attack Manhattan. They go all the way up the east side and to the Harlem area, and then they cross over to reach the Hudson. And at the Hudson River is Fort Washington, met on the other side in New Jersey with Fort Lee. If you have ever crossed the George Washington Bridge before, well, that's where the forts were, right where the footings of the bridge are. So when it comes to Fort Washington, there's a council of war, and it's basically we lose New York or we put up a final stand here at Fort Washington. And we have about 3,000 troops, and the British, who also have Hessians, have a lot more, and a lot more places as well. The War Council says, no, we need to leave. And Greene is the only opposing force to actually have the battle. So the battle happens. Washington decides to go with Greene. The battle happens, and it's bad. It's only as bad as you could actually expect. We had no chance there. I don't understand it. So every single man captured. There were quite a few casualties as well, but every man was captured, and we just lost 19 pieces of artillery. So that was a big loss. The important key part to remember on this is Washington doesn't lose confidence in Greene. This would have been the chance to do so, but he doesn't. In fact, he actually takes responsibility, saying it was his choice, which it was, but Greene was the only one who was trying to convince him to take the battle. So Greene and Washington do escape. They're in New Jersey now, and Washington doesn't know this yet, but he's about to find out really fast. But just in case, Greene had actually set up a retreat line, or a supply line, to cover a retreat for 2,000 men, which oddly enough, at this point, we have 2,000 men of the 24,000 that we had actually started with initially. So that supply line led us across New Jersey and right into Pennsylvania. And before we get into Pennsylvania, we have to cross the Delaware River. So in other words, the whole reason we actually ended up where we did at Washington's Crossing was because that's where the supply line Greene had set up went. Because we are in 1776 now, and we're coming close to the end of it. So with that ending, here comes the Battle of Trenton and Princeton with the Washington's Crossing right there. Just a little factoid, so you do know. If you look at the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, you see that gentleman in the blue who's leaning over the side in the center. That's General Greene right there. So that puts an end to 1776, and we actually enter into winter quarters. We come out of winter quarters in spring of 1777, but we're hitting a stalemate right here, because again, we don't know what Howe is doing. Last we knew, he captured New York and he was there, but he's getting ready to plan an attack and we can't figure out where. Washington assumes it's going to be Philadelphia, which it does turn out being, by the way. and tries to position himself to put up a stand against that. But Hal sails back and forth several times for ultimately coming into the Chesapeake Bay and landing in the Head of Elk, or which is now Elkton, Maryland. And from there, his troops are going to march on to Philadelphia. So there's a couple of places that fights were put up against, battles and skirmishes. It started in Delaware, and this is the only engagement that actually takes place in Delaware. It's actually in Glasgow, right near the Newark line in Delaware, northern Delaware, called Couch's Bridge. And that's just a small skirmish that doesn't really slow the British down all that much. And they start moving on, which I think we're going to do too, because it almost looks like storms are rolling in. We had some really extremely heavy downpours earlier today. It's supposed to clear up, but that doesn't look very promising. So after the Battle of Couch's Bridge comes the Battle of Brandywine. Brandywine is in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. It's a pretty neat battlefield. It's a privately owned battlefield, but they only own maybe 1/50th of this battlefield, which is a decent amount of area, but it was a huge battlefield, which is now shopping centers and residential areas as well, unfortunately. So Brandywine is, we have an introduction to somebody here. We've got a couple introductions coming up here of people who've made huge, big names for themselves. But in this case, I'm talking about the Marquis de Lafayette, the young 19-year-old French royalty who is now a brigadier general in the Continental Army. Now, Greene was the youngest general in the army until, excuse me, wow, I'm getting ahead of myself here. He's a major general in the Continental Army. There we go.
From Wikipedia, in the Union Army.
No, that's not what I'm talking about. Thank you. Appreciate that, Watch. So, wow, I just got myself lost because I was given false information. So Marquis de Lafayette is Major General Lafayette now. And the Battle of Brandywine was a loss. It wasn't a horrible battle, it was hot. It was one of two battles that you had actually more casualties from the heat than you did from the battle itself. So we set up for a retreat because we had lost what we needed to do. And even though Lafayette was injured during this, he had actually covered the retreat and got the Continental Army to safe position, to which they had now marched on to Valley Fort. And this was going to be the winter encampment for the army. There was one more battle or skirmish, whatever you want to call it, at Germantown, which is just outside of Philadelphia. But even though it had involved Henry Knox and a couple other big names, it was still a really bad defeat. So Howe is now in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia really held zero military value whatsoever. It didn't actually serve much purpose for them to do that, other than a morale blow, which would be my best guess personally, which I guess it would be. We just got the Capitol, but Congress had already fled long before they had arrived. They went to Yorktown, which is now York, Pennsylvania, and he made his quarters there. So in Valley Forge, which is northwest about 20 miles away, the Continental Army was going to change for good. for a good reason, I guess I could say. However, Greene's life is going to change as well. He has a couple of big things that happens here. So we'll talk about Greene, but we'll start with Thomas Mifflin, Quartermaster General Thomas Mifflin. He's not quite up to the task. He's not doing horrible, but he's not doing great. He's getting the supplies near where they need to be, but not finishing the task and getting them all the way. So it's time to do a change for Quartermaster General. Washington wants Greene. Greene for the logistical skills that he learned in the Iron Forge in his home. And he proved when he did his supply lines, natural pick would be Greene. Greene was very reluctant. He did not want to take the position. He says no Quartermaster General has ever made it into the history books. There's a couple, dozen of them, no big deal. So so he gets a couple things here. The first thing he gets is now he gets his second star. He is now Major General. So keep in mind, Washington only has 3 stars. Well, not only. Washington has 3 stars. That's the highest you can get there. So Greene is now 2 stars as a Major General. Becoming Quartermaster General, and this is something that's unique to the Continental Army, but you become second in charge of the entire army. And the reason for that is, I mean, you're not just doing logistics and supplies. You handle the battle plans. You are at Washington's side at all times. Basically, if it comes to a battle and Washington can't attend, the Quartermaster General knows what to do. So he's second in command now. So he ends up getting supplies to Valley Forge. Unfortunately, it's really just not enough. But they were in better shape already, having Greene in place, so that's good. The other thing that happens at Valley Forge is Baron von Steuben, Major General Baron von Steuben. He comes from the Prussian army, and he turns our gaggle into an army, a trained and professional army. Troops now know what to do. They're trained because of what General von Steuben did. It's kind of surreal out here right now. So now coming out of Valley Forge, we're in 1778. General Howe decides he's going to leave Philadelphia, just leave it, and he wants to head to Manhattan. So he starts marching his troops across New Jersey to get to a point called Sandy Point. And Washington hears of this move, and he goes and he picks a fight. He has a new army, nice army. He's very proud of, very happy, but he wants to put them to use. So they catch up with him in New Jersey at a place called Monmouth. Now Monmouth is to be the last major engagement in the North for the entire war. General Charles Lee gets placed in command of the battle with basically one rule: don't retreat. Well, almost immediately Lee calls for a retreat. So Washington jumps on the field. Nobody wants to say exactly what was said, but rumors is a lot of expletives, to where Lee was told to quit the field. I know that part. To quit the field as Washington took command. So he rallied the troops and went on the attack. This was the other battle that I was talking about earlier. More casualties from heat than battle. It's a big turtle over there. Huge head is hanging out there. So he comes and he takes over the battle, and he comes up with a draw. He doesn't win, but he gets a draw, and he's really happy about it. Greene's there. Greene is in the command of the artillery, which is basically in command of Henry Knox at that point. And so after the draw, Hal continues on with what he was doing. He was evacuating. So we now controlled New Jersey again. Even though we would have anyway, now we officially did. So now, focus of the war has shifted down south. Things are already going on. Greene heads to Rhode Island and attends the Battle of Rhode Island. That one was also a loss. Ooh. Thought that we had something there. I'm over here looking at the turtle to our left. Well, my line's to the right. So that battle was a loss, and the British still held Newport. But they didn't really for too long, because Rochambeau would come later on, but that's neither here nor there. General Lincoln was sent down to the south to where he gets to Charlestown and loses Charlestown. Decides to man a fort that's completely surrounded by water, and it's just a disaster waiting to happen. So the Continental Army, the Congress, sends another general down. He sends Horatio Gates. Horatio Gates is a name that you might have heard from Saratoga and some other things too. As they send him down there, and it doesn't go very well at all. He gets to Camden, and at the Battle of Camden, the defeat is so bad that Gates had actually jumped on his horse and rode it until it died. Then he actually did it again with the closest horse he could find, and he was said to have been over 100 miles away by morning. Just wanted to get away from the horrors of that battle. So now we had two generals down there that had basically just decimated what little of an army we already had. We only had, I guess you could say. And now we needed somebody else to go down there to take the reins. Congress finally gave Washington his choice on who should be down there. And he wrote to Greene and said, "It is my choice to choose you," quotation. So Greene's only request is, can I go home to Rhode Island and see Katie before I go? Which was denied. He was needed to get down there. So this is where Greene starts to shine. This is his first independent command, and he does not waste any time in getting things done. He's in charge of all troops from Delaware to Georgia. The wind has, for the most part, died down. It's like glass out here. And on the way down, he's heading towards Savannah here. Now, on the way down, he's stopping by and seeing the governors of every state now to try to get more troops, more money, basically anything that he can to, keep his army going now. He's not really that successful. Even though good old buddies of his, Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, were pretty much useless to get him help. They just didn't have it to give him. So he does get some stuff and supplies and men, and he heads down. And he starts to set forth a strategy he has in mind that's pretty much never been seen before. He starts drawing away from the shore, basically enticing General Cornwallis, British General Cornwallis, away from the shore and chase his army. He's trying to do a cat and mouse game here. And Cornwallis takes the bait. It's a good thing to say while fishing, right? So he takes the bait and he starts following him. Now, keep in mind, Georgia and the Carolinas and Virginia are all what we're going to be dealing with here. They're not nearly as big now or then as they are now. We weren't allowed to settle anywhere west of the Appalachians. So basically, you hit. Ooh, there's a nice jump over there. Do I still have my whopper popper? Yeah. Throw this one more time, and then we're gonna head over there with the whopper popper. So he splits his army in two. He sends General Daniel Morgan with the cavalry and some men off to go to the west, while he takes the more northern approach, and he's almost heading to North Carolina already. He's having little battles here, little battles there, little skirmishes, I guess you say. And he has where his quote is, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." One of his most famous quotes right there, because that's what he was doing. He was putting up the fight, getting beat, but then heading out, rising and fighting again. The whole purpose of this was he was really trying to deplete the supplies of Cornwallis. So it's both, get rid of his men and his supplies with no way to replenish. Yeah, a little bit of rain happening, yay. With no way to replenish is what his goal is. So now Cornwallis needs to be able to find a way to replenish himself. So we have the Battle of Cowpens, which was Daniel Morgan defeating Bannister Tarleton, Colonel Tarleton, in quite a crushing defeat, which was well deserved. And then you had Greene, who did Guilford Courthouse, face to face with Cornwallis. You could almost say a draw for that one. After Guilford Courthouse, it became what was known as the Race to the Dan. The Dan River separates North Carolina and Virginia. So basically, the idea is whoever gets there first, whoever crosses first wins. You find a way to replenish yourself better. And Greene does, because Greene also needed to get replenished too. He wasn't just doing that to Cornwallis, he was doing it to himself. So Greene does that, Cornwallis gets across, and Greene crosses back over. Cornwallis heads straight to Yorktown, Virginia, knowing that there's the British fleet coming into the Chesapeake Bay to be able to replenish them. Oh man, there's a jump like right near where I threw it. So once the British fleet gets to the Chesapeake Bay, they run into the long lost French fleet, which is our allies now. And the battle happens, and the British never get to enter. So basically Washington, who comes with Rochambeau and Lafayette on the W3R, sets up a siege on Yorktown. 2 weeks later, Cornwallis surrenders all of his men. This is basically the unofficial ending to the Revolutionary War. There's a huge blue jay that just flew out of that tree. So Greene was not at Yorktown. What Greene did is he went back across into Carolina. He had 3 particular cities in mind. He had Wilmington, North Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. He wanted to recapture those cities right there. even though Yorktown was the unofficial end to the Revolutionary War, the most bloody part of the war were the following 2 years afterwards, and that was General Greene cutting through the southern colonies. He gets Savannah, he gets Wilmington, and his last stop will be Charlestown, excuse me. He is in Eutaw Springs, which is just outside of Charlestown, and he goes against Colonel Stewart, British Colonel Stewart, which is the last engagement of the Revolutionary War. Not long after that, the Treaty of Paris gets signed, and Greene stays there and marches into Charleston right as the British were boarding the ship. Quite a ceremonious moment. Ah, there's jumps everywhere, but not near my whopper popper. I can't really put my whopper popper there, can I? Yeah, not bad. Okay. There's a grass surrounding it, so. So that right there is now the end of the Revolutionary War. So what is Greene to do? Well, there's a part that I left out that we're gonna have to talk about now. Well, not now. We're gonna have to talk about it after I get a drink of water. Ah, there we go. Much better. So, how was Greene able to resupply his army when he was down south? Greene had gotten together with a gentleman named John Banks. And John Banks was one of the few people, one of the main people, known as the financier of the Revolutionary War. So he met with John Banks, and John Banks said, just sign the IOUs and I'll reimburse you after the war. Okay, sounds like a great deal. Let's do it. The war ends, and Greene goes to find John Banks. It takes him quite some time to find him. He's in prison. He's in debtor's prison. He's a con man. So here's the problem. Greene is now on the hook for all the money. So feeling that he has no other choice because now he's poor, he went to his brother Jacob and he signed over both the forge and his home over to his brother. Now we're going to go off a little side tangent here. So now we know it's Jacob's side of the family in the home, and they lived there until 1899. And then in 1899, while still owned by the Greenes, they rented it out to be a boarding school, and that was until 1919. In 1919, four gentlemen formed what's now known as the Nathanael Greene Homestead Association, and bought the homestead's property. And their purposes was to open it up as a museum, which is something that stands today. That's what we do there. All right, so getting back to Greene. So Greene signs his home over to his brother, and what he does is he moves to Newport, and he lives there for about 2 years. And nice throw. While he's living there, there's a plantation just outside of Savannah, Georgia, and it's called Mulberry Grove. It's a rice plantation. This is being prepared for the new owner, General Greene, to make residence there. So he goes and lives there at Mulberry Grove, the rice plantation, to try to rebuild his fortune and his name. Now, he actually received this plantation as a gift for his work with the Continental Army. The state of Georgia had confiscated this as Mulberry Grove, a Tory plantation, and then awarded it to Greene. So Greene is there now, and he's doesn't really know how to do anything with rice, but he's learning. And he's there for about 8 months, and a gale comes along. Gale is pretty much, you know, nothing to us, just a strong wind. But gale is the name for hurricane back then. So a gale comes along, and he wants to go survey the damage to his crops the next day. While he's out there, he gets an increasingly bad headache. That night he lays down, and he stays in bed for 2 days, and this is where he dies. He dies of sunstroke or heat stroke at 44 years old. So there's no money to bury him yet. We haven't rebuilt the fortune. Poor Katie's there in Mulberry Grove. They bury him in the Graham Vault. The Graham Vault, he's in the Graham Vault in an unmarked grave. When we're gonna fast forward here. Let me get my head straight here. We're in the year of 1901 now. The Sons of American Revolution chapters, both Georgia and Rhode Island, are getting together, and both are deciding that, you know, something more suitable needs to be done with the corpse of General Greene, something more appropriate for what he has done. The plan is to exhume his body and put it somewhere different. Both states were fighting, saying he's ours, he's ours. And I'm not sure what the deciding factor was, but Georgia won. So they exhumed General Greene, and they didn't just exhume General Greene. They had found that his son, George Washington Greene, everything had basically disintegrated in between everybody, in between them, and they had nothing but mingled bones together of both father and son. So they exhumed both father and son and reinterred them in a place called Johnson Square, which is in downtown Savannah, Georgia. If you ever go to Savannah, Georgia, their squares are definitely something to see. They take a lot of pride in them, and it shows. However, Johnson Square has a 50-foot obelisk on it, and if you look at the inscription, you'll see that both father and son of George Washington Greene and General Nathanael Greene are buried here, and that is his final resting place. And here we are at the boat ramp. Thanks for watching, guys.